Good evening, everyone. I hope you all had a fantastic day. I know delegate attendees, I'm sorry, I know you've heard this a few times, but please submit your feedback forms. It's really important for us to improve and innovate and help build connections for the future. And now for the next part of our assembly, as you guys still enjoy eating, I am delighted to introduce to all tonight's superstar here at the Barton Creek. He is the former Chief Supply Chain Officer at Macy's, Dennis Mullahy. So please help me in welcoming Dennis.
Okay, the superstar part we can let go of, because I would argue all of you out here are superstars. I mean, everybody who's dealt with supply chain over the last 4 years has done a yeoman's effort to keep things moving. And so I want to, one, just say that. Two, I really want to thank the folks at the Millennium Alliance for inviting me. I think this conference has been great. I've been to a lot of these things, but the connectivity, the ability to get together with peers, I've met some new friends, I've met some old friends and some colleagues, and so it's been great. I think it's been a wonderful day one, and so hopefully you all got a lot out of that. And then second, just before we start, just a huge thank you to the Barton Creek staff, because this is an amazing resort, and I think getting dinner out and everything is just phenomenal. Okay, I tend to walk a lot when I talk, and I tend to use my hands, so I'm hoping I don't throw this glass of water on anybody while we go through this. And please enjoy your dinner while we talk. What I wanted to do today was really just spend time talking about supply chain strategy and talking about how we need to evolve our thinking on supply chain strategy. And I really am hopeful that this will be a discussion, not a lecture, because I'm nowhere near qualified to be a professor to any of you, but I have gone through a lot of this. And so I wanted to spend time talking about how we thought about supply chain strategy, how we used that during the pandemic, during 2020 and 2021, and some simple things that we put in place that really guided us as we thought through what that was. So super excited to be here. I'll give you a little background on myself. So I am the former Chief Supply Chain Officer for Macy's. I was the first Chief Supply Chain Officer that Macy's hired. I just retired in July. After the last 4 years of keeping everything running and moving, it was exhausting, and I took the opportunity to take a step back and to really think about what I want to do. And so I'm doing a little advising and consulting work and board work while I kind of figure out the next phase of where I'm headed. But I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really proud to be here with the Millennium Alliance team. So what we're going to talk about today is really a discussion on evolving supply chain strategy to account for the rapidly changing demand signals and global disruption. And I think for a long time, supply chain strategy, especially in retail, has been understated, undervalued, and underused. And I think for the most part, it has been considered a necessary evil of moving goods until the pandemic hit. And then everybody realized the importance. I used to joke with my wife that, when we would watch Chuck Todd on Sunday morning and he would be like, we're going to talk about supply chain disruption. I'm like, it's going to be a bad week because there's a whole bunch of people who are going to make a whole bunch of assumptions on stuff they don't know. So I think this is a wonderful quote, right? However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results, right? Because I think sometimes we get caught up in our strategies and we don't realize the impact that they're having on our business or how we're evolving. So I think this is like something to always keep in mind. How do we always make sure that we're looking at the results of what we're doing against the strategy that we do? I also don't believe strategy is a one and done. It's an evolution. It's a constantly evolving thing that we should talk about. So our little agenda today. One, I want to spend a moment and define supply chain strategy. Now, that may sound really rudimentary to everybody in this room who does supply chain strategy on a regular basis. However, I think it's important that we're all on the same page of what a strategy is and what a strategy is not. So I want to spend a moment and just say, when we talk supply chain strategy, what is a supply chain strategy? Then we're going to spend a few moments just high level, okay, here's inputs, constraints, and outcomes that we typically try to get out of a supply chain strategy. But then I want to focus on how do we think about the unknown? What is the unknown? How do we think about it? What do we do with it? And then how do we incorporate agility into the strategies that we're building? Like I said, I really would like this to be a discussion all the way throughout, so if you have any questions or comments, or if I say something that you totally disagree with, raise your hand and let's talk about it. Because again, I think this is a good opportunity for us to both learn and share with each other. And hopefully that will happen as we go through this presentation today. Okay, so definition of supply chain strategy. I did the most detailed research I could think of, and I Googled, what is supply chain strategy? And here's what I found. Supply chain strategy is the overarching plan that an organization uses to manage flow. It's a process that manages networks and services. It's a strategy that defines the connection and combination of activities and functions. It's a strategy, a company overall game plan on how they're going to move product. And my conclusion was, none of that is a supply chain strategy. That is actually the definition of what a supply chain is. It is not a strategy on how you manage your supply chain. For it to be a strategy, it has to define the ongoing actions that you're going to take to optimize the flow of goods while you're managing the risks that you have. And so I wanted to take a step back and say, okay, let's talk about what that really looks like. So strategy, right? It's a detailed plan for achieving success in situations such as war, politics, business, industry, or sport, or it's the skill of planning for such situations, right? And so that's really defining what strategy should look like. And I love this quote as well, right? Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. The number of companies, so I think about my background, and I was going to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about me. I'll do that now. So I've been in the business for about 35 years. I spent the first 17 years of my career doing consulting work for Accenture, Arthur Andersen, Andersen Consulting, whatever name they had during that life cycle of the 17 years I was with them. I left. I then took a role running inventory management, merchandise planning for Meijer. I spent time at Ulta Beauty, helping them with their growth strategy. I went on to Michaels, where I ran technology and supply chain, and then I came to Macy's, where I ran supply chain. And that included both sourcing, product development, international domestic transportation, sustainability, operations, continuous improvement, and I'm sure there's something else that I'm forgetting that we did. But it included really end-to-end movement of goods. And the reason why I think this quote is so good is because the number of times I've walked into a new company and said, let's talk about your supply chain strategy. And the first thing that was handed to me was a list of initiatives. That is not a strategy. That is a list of tactics that you're going to go employ. We had a great conversation today in one of the breakout rooms on resiliency and whether resiliency is a tactic or a strategy. Again, I say that if it's not built into your strategy, you can't rely on it ever happening, right? Because then you're just throwing stuff at it. And so the point of this is really to say we need a strategy within supply chain, and we need to think about our supply chain strategy in a way that not only gives us the action plans, the timelines, but the outcomes that we need to be able to drive towards. So I put this together. This is my non-Google definition of a supply chain strategy. So it's the outcomes, actions, timelines necessary for an organization to achieve its future financial and customer objectives through the effective and efficient flow of goods, services, and materials while mitigating risk from disruption and reducing the impact on the environment they operate in. So why do I think that's more complete than movement of goods? Well, because one, it does talk about flow of goods, right? That's what we all do. Anybody in here who's part of supply chain, whether you're manufacturing, whether you're service, whatever it is, you're talking about the flow of some type of good and the movement of that product. And so that's really the main function of a supply chain. Financial objectives really starts to talk about business volume, constraints, costs. How do we think about our costs that we build in? Customer objectives gets to speed, whether that's an end customer who's buying stuff from your website that you're shipping to their house, or whether you're a B2B and you're providing something to another business, or whether that's just an interim customer when you're shipping product from your DCs into a store. Disruption, right? Addresses the need for the unforeseen challenges or changes, right? Because we all have to deal with that. None of us thought about that. Well, I think we all thought about it, but it was never as prominent as it was until 2020. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then finally, the environment. We all have a responsibility to drive sustainability throughout our networks and the actions and work that we do to protect the environment that we work in. So this was my proposed definition of what a supply chain strategy should be. Not what it is, but what it should be when we think about defining our strategies and the things that it should include. This is the part of discussion. I'm just kidding. So we'll take that. Now let's talk about inputs and constraints and outputs that we want to, or outcomes that we want to get from that. And again, I think that in order to have a strategy, you have to be thinking about not only what comes out of it, what actions do I have to take, but also what information do I need and what are my constraints that go into it. So let's talk about standard inputs, right? It starts with a detailed understanding of your business plan. For the next 3 to 5 years, where is the business heading? What's your projected volume? What type of volume is it going to be? Like for us at Macy's, we sell over 1 million SKUs. If our volume increase is going to come from big ticket, which is all of our furniture delivery, that's going to drive a different strategy that I need to make sure I'm ready for. If it's going to come out of D2C, our direct-to-consumer business, that requires a different strategy. So where is the volume coming from? What does that volume look like? Where is it going to originate from? Is it private label goods that I'm going to import directly that I've got to be moving across the ocean? Or is it going to be market brand product that I'm going to buy from somebody else? Am I going to store it and hold it? What am I going to do with it? So I really need to have a detailed understanding of what that plan is. Why 3 to 5 years? Because we all know, what is the one thing we know about supply chain changes? It takes a long time, right? None of it's simple, none of it's fast. You have a limited, especially in retail, you have a limited window of opportunity to make a change, right? So you figure peak is really running from inbound starts in September or October, runs through December. Those months are out. You're not doing any work on really changing anything there. You can start in January, but you got to be done before September the next year because everything has to be wrapped up so you can go back into peak. So there's time that has to be involved in this. And so we in supply chain have to be thinking further out. I don't know about you guys, but that's always been a challenge with my business partners. What do we think sales are going to be in 3 years? We don't know. I don't know how to build a supply chain for you then. Like we have to put bets down. We have to make decisions. We have to decide what the direction is going to be so that we can actually build a supply chain that can support it. Current performance. So current performance is really the understanding within your current network, how do you handle either those different volume movements? How do you handle those different types of products? What does that really look like from a cost profile perspective? And how do you think about those things as they happen today? It doesn't mean you can't change them, but as an input into your process of thinking through your strategy, understanding where you're at is the best place to start. And then finally, sustainability objectives, which is really what pressures are we going to get from government, from regulations, whether it's organizational goals to improve our sustainability, whether it's NGOs, whether it's investors. We all have some pressure to be more sustainable in what we do. And so how do we filter that in as an input into what our strategy should look like? Constraints, right? We all have them, right? You have a network that you run today, right? So your network configuration and what your network looks like is a physical constraint. If your building is in Washington State and your volume is going to come out of the East Coast, you have a long transportation. That is a physical constraint that you have to deal with. Your transportation network can be a physical constraint. And so how do you think about leveraging that as you build out the strategies? What constraints do you need to break? How do those constraints play into what you're thinking about comes next? Capacity and throughput. What volume can you do today? How much capacity do you have left over? How much throughput can you get? What could you do to accelerate that? What is that going to look like? What are your opportunities to go drive that, which will tell you where you're starting with? And then I don't know about all of you, but I can tell you over my career, technology and infrastructure has been a massive constraint everywhere I've gone. Whether we haven't updated our WMS, whether we haven't put in the right merchandise planning inventory management systems, whether we're not doing the right demand forecasting, whether we're not thinking about the way operations is going to run and the information that we need from them, all of those tend to be constraints that require some action, some event, some activity to go get over. And none of these are intended to say they're stopping points. But if we go back to the definition, right, and the definition of a supply chain strategy is defining those actions and events that lead you to get the outcomes, understanding this starts to make a clearer picture for you of the changes that you need to make inside of your strategy. And then outcomes. So identification of the action plans to support growth. So if we know growth is coming, we know where growth is going to come, what do we need to change? What actions do we need to take? What is the timeline to go do that? Can we do it in the time frame that the business is looking for? If the business says, hey, we're going to triple our D2C volume in the next year, if you don't own the capacity, how are you going to support that, right? How do you think about what that looks like? Reducing costs, right? I'm sure all of you have the same pressures on a daily, regular basis to reduce cost and to really drive down what you're spending money on and what your supply chain costs as a percent of sales are. And so how do you think about what that's going to look like, and how do you drive that into your operations to be able to really drive costs down? And then lastly, I would say customer service. And I think often, we don't link customer service back into supply chain, but the reality is, for most of us in retail, we are now the last face that the customer sees when we drop that package off. And so customer service is a big deal in how we think about interacting with the customer. And again, whether that's the customer in their home waiting for a package to be delivered, whether it's a customer at the store waiting for the truck to arrive, whether it's a B2B raw material movement, whatever that is, that customer impact has an ability to really influence what your strategy is going to look like. Now, the one thing I'd say on this that I think is really fascinating is really understanding what customer service you're trying to get to, right? So we were in a presentation today and someone was talking about same-day delivery and customers' expectations of next day. Who created the expectation that customers need product in 4 hours? Did customers create that? No. Does every product we sell need to be delivered to a customer's house same day or in 4 hours? No, not at all. You think about fashion, right? Tell me somebody who's buying fashion, a woman who's going to buy a dress for an event is buying it today to wear it tomorrow? She's going to a store. Like the probability, right, if you look at returns on apparel, it's in the 30 to 50% range. So when you look at that, shipping it fast doesn't help you. Shipping it right, making sure you're shipping it at the right cost, making sure that you're building that thing, and you really understand what customer service levels you're trying to get to. And alignment on that across the company is a big deal. Now, one of the other reasons why I think this is a big deal is because often some of our non-supply chain peers, and we can all talk about this because we're supply chain folks, right? So some of our non-supply chain executives listen to the news too often. And they're like, oh my God, Target's shipping everything out of their stores. We should ship out of our stores. Well, when you sell potato chips and you sell commodity product, yeah. If you're going to buy 100 dresses that you don't know where they're going to sell from, how many of those do you want to land in a store? Because all you're doing is putting markdown liability there. All you're doing is driving inventory productivity in the wrong direction, and all you're doing is causing more cost, right? And so really having that debate on what does customer service really look like? What are we intending to get to? What is the value of that? And then understanding how that flows back into your supply chain is a super important thing to go do. Everybody with me? Everybody stopped eating. I feel bad. Okay. So, accounting for the unknown. I think this is fascinating, right? Because I made a comment in one of the other meetings that, most of the challenges that we saw in 20 and 2021 weren't new. Other than the pandemic. I'll give everybody that, right? The pandemic, that was new. But the rest of it wasn't stuff that should have been surprising. It just all happened at the same time, right? And so we've never really had that situation where there was this kind of massive movement of so many unknown things occurring that we had to really work and operate differently. And so one of the things that I would contend, and we'll walk through why I believe this, is that we now, as we build strategies, have to build our strategies to account for the unknown. Now, obviously, if it's unknown, you'd say, how do we account for that? We'll talk about that later. But the ability to actually think through where your risks are, where the challenges are, and how you actually move through those is a super important thing to making sure your supply chain continues to operate in the way you want it to. Okay, so I thought this was really interesting. If you look at supply chain disruptions, and this is really defined as any event that impacts the movement of goods for manufacturing, sale, or distribution. 3,700 supply chain disruptions were reported in 2019, 11,642 in 2021. So what were they? Okay, so based on Supply Chain Dive, they went through and did all this research for me so I didn't have to, but put together kind of the top 10 reasons. So it started off with the winter storm in Texas. Anybody in here from Texas? Yeah. So we didn't. I grew up in the Northwest, so I knew what snow was, but nobody else understood ice. It was like everything shut down. It was bad. It was horrific. But it started with the winter storm. Then came the Suez Canal, right? You kind of look at it on the surface like, okay, it was like, that's not going to be so bad. We'll get past that. Then the coronavirus hit India and raw materials got stopped. Then port congestion in Yantian and LA started to build. Then the railroad closure into Chicago because they had too many empties and they couldn't figure out how to move them all and get them back to where they needed to be. That happened. Then you wind up with California wildfires, right, which blocked off the whole northwest part of the corridor from being able to move product. The Ningbo port closed and slowed down, right? So I think at one point they locked 20% of their workforce in the building, didn't let them leave, had them work on rotating shifts, and they ran at like 20% capacity. Shanghai airport terminal closed, which was moving a ton of freight overseas. Then you had a hurricane hit, and then you had Vietnam lockdown. All of those things added up to just massive amounts of disruption and massive amounts of us trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to get from point A to point B? And what do we got to do next? And where is that coming from? And how do we understand where we're going to go? But if you look at these things, the winter storm in Texas has nothing to do with the pandemic. Suez Canal has nothing to do with the pandemic. Port congestion in Yantian and LA, yes, it had something to do with the pandemic, but it also has to do with the fact that we have really bad port operations. I mean, you look at the infrastructure in the United States, and it's challenging, right? And you can go through this. California wildfires had nothing to do with the pandemic. There's a number of things on here that are not pandemic related that actually occurred all at the same time, causing the level of disruption. So if you look at what the disruption caused by kind of sector, it really impacted everybody. I mean, obviously, when you get down to like finance and insurance, there's little impact because there's little product flow that's happening. But this is based on 1 week survey that was done to say, were you impacted? And you can see over 60% of manufacturing, almost 60% of construction, half of retail, trade, everybody who was moving product or doing goods was impacted. Estimated financial cost, over $4 trillion of lost sales, of incremental costs, of movement that we had to go do that nobody wanted to do, all those things. So then you say, well, was it all the pandemic? I would again contend the pandemic was a big part of it. However, a lot of the things that we're seeing are not pandemic related. Demand variability. I was in one of the forecasting meetings, and I can't remember who was talking, but we were talking about demand variability. If you're a retailer and you've got demand shifting between channels at 8.5 to call it 10%, where do you place your inventory? Especially as a fashion retailer. Where do you put your inventory to be able to support that? Because it's not that sales are growing 8.5%, it's that penetration of digital is growing, and digital fulfillment is significantly different than store fulfillment. Labor shortages. Labor shortages are real, right? In 2019, and this is just an example, 2019, the US government estimated that there were 60,000 open jobs for truck drivers. 60,000 open jobs for truck drivers. The average age of a truck driver is 56 years old. I know they're working to change this, and I don't believe they've changed it yet. But in the United States, to drive a truck, to get your truck driver's license, drive a semi, you have to be 21 years old. It takes 2 years to be able to get insured. So you're now 23. Anybody know of a kid graduating from high school who says, I'm going to kick back for 3 years and do nothing until I can wait so I can get my truck driver's license? Right? None of that's occurring. So we have a shortage of drivers. We can't attract young people in because we have this age requirement that we can't get past. And by the time you're 21, you're already off doing something else. And so driving people into that doesn't become a career option for them to choose from. Raw material shortages continue to be an issue. 71% of global companies this year have highlighted raw materials as a risk. Extreme weather. I thought this was fascinating. 1980 to 1999, 4,212 natural disasters. 2000 to 2019, 7,348. That's like double in the same period of time. Do we think that's going to get any better? Cost increases. This is an example from the pandemic, but I don't know how about you guys, but I didn't plan for a 15.5% cost increase on a container in my budget. right? And the financials that I was telling the company I was going to go get, I didn't plan for that. I didn't plan for an 8.3% globally and a 15.5% just US to Asia. So again, I'd make the argument that the unknown is here to stay. And it's a reality that we all have to face to think through how do we actually go start to drive different solutions, different strategies, and different conversations with our leadership teams on how we're building out our strategies and the things that we need to go do. Make sense? Very quiet group. Okay. So, I did this little survey. I thought this was fascinating. I went out. There's a Gartner peer community. If you're not part of it, it's actually kind of interesting. They go out and share a bunch of statistics, and you can ask them questions. But I did this little poll out there on, what do you think is the biggest risk, right? And you can see it goes anywhere from international destabilization at 48% to labor markets at 5%, extreme weather at 10%, 24% of the people think government regulations. You got 14% of the people saying, we just got bad infrastructure, and it's going to continue to be a problem. I then asked the same group, okay, so what are you doing to solve for it? And it was interesting because I've heard a lot of different things. I've heard people say, we're going to add inventory. We're going to add inventory to increase our safety stock so that we don't have the fear of running out if risk occurs. All that does is add costs on an everyday basis when you don't need it. Adding labor, same thing, right? So some of the things that got thrown out there, improved data capture and analytics, expanding vendor sourcing through multi-country or multi-vendor, adding automation to increase flexibility. The person who voted other was like all of them, which is actually the right answer. Leveraging third-party flexibility and relationships, and then really forecasting and predictive systems. So I thought it was interesting just to hear that it's obviously on people's minds, but how do we, again, think about it holistically as we think about strategies that we're building? I then asked, okay, so where are you at in implementing it? You can see overwhelmingly, people are below 50%. Some people are just getting started. There's a few outliers out there who believe they're all the way done with it. I think this is one of those things that you'll never be done with. I think it's an ongoing conversation of how do you continue to think about building resiliency and building this into your strategy. So, you look at global supply chain, and you look at all the things we talked about, and this is just a couple of them: weather, international destabilization, labor markets, port disruptions, infrastructure, government regulations. All of those things are coming at us on a regular basis. Does anybody know when they're going to happen? Does anybody know which one's going to happen? So uncertainty of where and how requires us to think about how we build agility into our supply chain. How do we think differently about the strategies that we're putting in place, and how do we think about adding that into not just the movement of goods, not just the flow of goods, not just managing the capacity, managing the workforce, managing all those other things, but how do we start to account for those things that are going to cause us problems, because we all know they're going to happen. And increasingly more often now than ever before. So, how do we incorporate agility into the supply chain strategy? And so I want to walk you through what we did and how we leveraged this throughout the pandemic in 2020, how we leveraged it in 2021 to manage our inventory flow, and in 2022 to make sure that we didn't get overbought, and how did we actually use that to incorporate into our ongoing work that we think about every day as we think about the supply chain. 3 really simple things, and we landed on 3 because we thought it was easier than 10, and we didn't want to have a huge model. Visibility. Can I see what's happening? Do I have the right information metrics? Do I have the right data flowing to me so that I have visibility of what's going on at every node that I'm talking about? Predictability. Where can I drive better amounts of predictability? And I think we have to rethink how we think about predictability, right? So there's a ton of great inventory forecasting systems out there. There's a ton of great, but predictability on lead times, predictability on throughput, predictability on labor markets, predictability on country shutdowns. All of those things are important as you think about how you're placing your product and your movement through. And the last one, which I think is the most difficult, is flexibility. How and where in a physically constrained supply chain can I add flexibility to impact the flow of goods? And so let's take each one of these just as an example of kind of some of the things we did. And I will tell you, again, this is an ongoing effort and an ongoing piece of work that I think will continue to happen all across time as we think about it. But visibility, starting with really what's a network product flow map, what's that look like? So an integrated network model, identifying each node, internal and external. What are the capabilities within that node? What can it do? What are the constraints? Where is it going? KPIs and metrics. This is one of my favorites. What are you going to measure? And I will argue, I put this word meaningful, because meaningful is really important. Because sometimes there's like 10,000 metrics, but they're not meaningful. I'll give you a couple examples. When I got to Macy's, one of the things we used to talk about was how long it took us to unload a truck. And we used to tell the store teams, you got so many days, and if you don't hit that day, then you're off your KPI. So I had store teams, or I had DC teams working overtime to unload a truck. Guess what happened when they unloaded that truck? It went to another truck where it sat for 4 days waiting for the outbound to go. So I just spent a ton of money on a metric that didn't cost me anything, didn't add any value, to tell people, we need you to go faster. Why? Right? I need the inbound to go on that truck when it goes outbound. I obviously don't want to work overtime. I also don't want you to be slow. I want you to be efficient and productive, but I want you to be smart. The other one, and hopefully I don't offend any finance people in here, but finance people can be the worst with metrics. Oh my good Lord. So, we used to talk about cost per carton on outbound. Our cost per carton was this. And so people would say, well, if volume is going down, then we're going to lower your delivery. Okay, but trucks stayed the same. I took one box off, right? I didn't really save anything. I still had to move the truck. It has nothing to do. All I did was make every box in that truck more expensive, but the truck still has to go. So cartons aren't the driver of my outbound. My outbound delivery schedule is the driver of my outbound, and the trucks I have to take to go to the destinations they need to go to. And so I would tell you, this is one of the hardest things to get your arms around, is what are the right metrics to look at? What are the right things? And I would also tell you to think about them more externally focused than internally focused as well. So one of the things that we started measuring and getting visibility to during the pandemic was the COVID rates that were happening in every country. And so we would go through and we would look at, okay, what's happening with Vietnam, what's happening with India, what's happening with every place that we produced. And we created a really simple green, yellow, red scorecard. This country's doing bad. All our factories are still running, but the country's yellow. So that gave us reason to pause and say, okay, we've already lined up multi-country manufacturing. We're going to place the next order. Let's place it in India instead of Vietnam so that we can get our product moving, right? And so we were able to capture the information, create metrics and KPIs, get some level of predictability from that to actually change the result on the back end. Predictability, so predictive modeling, right? So what internal and external information can you gather or can you use to really generate a predictive model by node and an understanding of what the implications are downstream? So for this node, if this is going to happen, if product's going to be late, what is the impact of that as I think further down the supply chain? And then scenario. Scenario planning is huge in this, right? If that happens, what does it mean? What's my cost? What is it really going to look like? How do I leverage those KPIs to say, okay, if this occurs, I want to go do that? And that starts to define for you where you have opportunities to build more things into your network. So we did the same thing, as I was mentioning on the sourcing side, we did the same thing with labor. We started predicting what our labor models were going to look like, how much labor were we going to get. Out of that, I was able to say, okay, if my Tennessee building is going to run at 62% of my labor force, I want to manage the outbound that I put there. I can't send as many direct-to-consumer orders there. Yes, I can drive some productivity and I can get some value out of it, but at the same time, I can't land all that because I don't have the workforce to go do that. And so leveraging that level of predictability on where my workforce was going to be and what that model was going to look like allowed us to move product to where we wanted it to be when we shipped it. And then as I mentioned, flexibility. I think flexibility is the hardest one. So based on predictive models and based on the network map, where can you actually drive flexibility to change the flow of goods? So one of the things for us, we run deconsolidation and consolidation centers. on the East Coast and West Coast. We actually used a 3PL to do that. We actually didn't have them really doing anything. They were just basically taking product in, consolidating it, deconsolidating it, moving it out. As we started to look at it and we started to build out our map, we started to say, okay, well, what opportunities do we have at the merge centers if we wanted to change direction of product? So if I said I bought something for this store or for this DC, but that store or DC wasn't selling, or that store or that DC was down, how can I redirect it at the point of receipt at a merge center to make it go somewhere else? And so what technology would I need to do that? What capabilities would I need to have? How would I physically go do that so that that box that came in with that label that was supposed to go this way is now going to go that way? We leveraged that tremendously during 20 and 21 as we were trying to figure out where product was going to come and where it was going to flow through, is how do we actually start to think about all the different places we want to put it into. Physical and technical capabilities. So this is another one where physically, what can you go do, right? You can't take a building that's doing cross-dock information or doing cross-dock primarily as their role and start saying, I want you to piece pick. Like, it just doesn't happen, right? It's not an overnight thing. There's a whole lot of work you have to go do to do that, to figure out if they actually can go do that. But what are your physical constraints and what are your technology constraints? And then the last one is the ROI models. Because every piece of flexibility is not value, right? Flexibility tends to cost you money, right? But at the same time, it saves you money when you have a problem and you need it, right? And so how do you build the ROI models to say, okay, when am I going to trigger this? What's that going to look like? And how am I going to go after it? So where do you start? So we started with looking at where are all the constraints? Where are the biggest bottlenecks or constraints that we have in the current model, right? What bottlenecks do we have? What's going to impact the flow of goods? Where do we have the most risk? What's that really going to look like? And do we have the necessary visibility and predictability that we would like at that node? And if not, then that became part of our strategy to start thinking about, I want this level of visibility. I want to see what's happening. I want to understand lead times. I want to understand movement. I want to understand flow. And then we started looking at what's the points of failure, right? So the first one, inventory placement, right? Inventory placement being a point of failure, meaning if I land product in the wrong location, I can't do anything with it, right? So if I was to deploy all my fashion goods, excuse me, if I was to deploy all my fashion goods out to the stores and they're in the wrong places where the customers aren't shopping, I got a huge problem, right? Because now I either have incremental costs to go move that stuff out of there somewhere else, which is not going to be beneficial, or I'm going to have to take markdowns and liability on it. So inventory placement, it was a key point of failure for us to look at and to say, how do we de-risk that? Inventory flow. So again, where do I think I could have a flow stoppage? Could be one of my D2C buildings go down, right? We had an issue in 2018 where one of our buildings caught on fire and we had to redirect product. So how do I think about adding that into the capabilities of my network and not causing a customer impact or a financial impact? And then operational utilization, which is really around understanding what the demand looks like, where you're underutilized, where do you have an opportunity to add utilization or capacity or capabilities that you could go leverage. We took all of this and started building out a map, multi-year plan of saying, where would I want to be able to see more, predict more, and do something different? And how do I physically go after that inside of the network? So some of the things that I would say, we looked at in pieces of the run. So one, on the visibility side, control towers, right? Everybody's talking about them. They're out, whether you use a control tower, we kind of built our own. We built our own metrics, KPIs, dashboards, all of those things. But this is one where it really takes a concerted effort to not allow yourself to have 10,000 KPIs because you'll never be able to manage them and they're not all useful. And so really challenging yourself to say, why do I want to see this? What do I want to see? And what am I going to do with it? If it's just information, that's fascinating. But if it's data that can drive decisions, then how do we bottle that? How do we make sure it's visible? And how do we watch it? Predictability. Demand reforecasting, which I think is really fascinating. So there's a company out of Prague who's doing kind of short-in demand reforecasting, looking at where assets have been deployed to. Are those assets still in the best place as you would have thought they would have been based on activity that's happening? And if not, is there a financial model that lets you move them? It's fascinating, right? I mean, being able to rethink your demand forecasting with an ROI attached to it that says this makes sense to go move at enough volume and quantity. Lead time forecasting. So the ability to be able to say, okay, what's happening with ports? Where do I see congestion? Where do I see things happening? We got a ton of information, like I said, from countries. We got a ton of information from our overseas carrier partners. We got a ton of information that we would plow into saying what's happening with lead times. And if I'm seeing it kind of inch up, what can I do about it? Do I need to redirect product? Do I need to redirect flow? Do I need to change marketing calendars? Because now I'm not going to land the product at the time when it's going to be promoted. All of those things play into kind of how you start to think about predictability and what do you do with it. Because not all of these answers will be supply chain answers. Some of these might be, hey, I just predicted we've got a problem, and I can't do anything about it financially that's going to make sense, so we should not do that. And then lastly, flexibility. And again, as I said, this one I think is one of the hardest. I'm really encouraged, though, because I've talked to a lot of, so in my retirement, one of the things I've been doing is doing a lot of advisory and consulting work and talking with private equity and VC companies. And it's really fascinating some of the things that are out there now. And so there's this company out there called Warp. Warp is an interesting company out of California. They're doing optimization of LTL movement. And so one of the things that we all hate and no one really focuses on is the cost of LTL and what happens with LTL and why LTL is so painful and slow. But if you can actually figure out a way to optimize LTL to make it the same cost as a truckload movement, then could you start moving inventory in smaller quantities so that you're not deploying as much out farther and you can react differently? So it's a fascinating model. And again, I think it's one of those things where there's more innovation coming as people start to think through these places of where would we want flexibility. And I've used this word a lot as I've talked around our partners. I mentioned our carrier partners. I'm a huge believer in partners and relationships. I think transactional business is interesting and appropriate for some things, but for a lot of things, you survive way much better if you have the partnership. And we had these conversations with all of our partners. We need flexibility. I need the flexibility when it comes in to be able to do something different. I need the visibility to what's happening. I need the predictability. And so back in 2020 when UPS was blowing up and nobody thought they were going to deliver product, I actually ran the latest I've ever run in home delivery at Christmas and had full volume and capacity through UPS to go do that. Mostly because they're a great partner. And we had a great relationship with them. And we really spent time building that relationship with them. But it allowed us that level of flexibility to say, hey, I'm not going to hit my forecast. My product's going to come out late because timing of deliveries is going to be a problem. But I still needed to get to the customer before Christmas. And we were able to move through all of that. And then finally, the last one on flexibility is inventory deployment and thinking about where are you actually placing your inventory. Are you placing your inventory in places that gives you flexibility? So again, I'll go back to the conversation we were having on store deliveries. So if you think about customer delivery out of a store, direct-to-consumer buy, servicing out of a store. For fashion, if I deploy my inventory in a manner that's forward deploying it down to all of those store nodes, I gotta hope that the customer who's buying it is actually in that area to go buy it, right? Otherwise, I've just landed, this suit that I'm the only one that likes out in California that's now got to ship across the country to the East Coast. And I have to have everything else that I would have ordered in that store. It's a huge problem to solve when you're talking about a million SKU footprint and a fashion product that's changing on a regular basis. If you're talking about commodity product, forward deployment is easier. But how much inventory do you want to put out there and how much risk do you want to take on the capital side of it to actually deploy that inventory and what's that financially worth? Right? More inventory you have tends to be more shrink, tends to be more damages, tends to be more problems. And so inventory deployment is one of those strategies that really plays into how do you think about managing through risk. Okay, I think I went backwards. I did. So this is now the point in time where I would love to hear feedback from you guys on your thoughts. What I'm really encouraged about is through this conference that a lot of the conversations that I've sat in, this topic has come up in a lot of different ways of being able to add this level of flexibility. And I think it's on all of us as supply chain professionals to start to think about how do we do that and how do we drive flexibility into our networks and into our adjoining networks that we all share. Because if we can, not only can we mitigate risk, but we can also solve some of our sustainability problems. We can solve some of our emission problems. We can actually make the world a better place, right? And I think that is a challenge for all of us to think about of how do we leverage those kind of interconnected networks and those interconnected things that we share to be able to go drive that while we're mitigating our risk in terms of supply chain. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes?
I have one question. You said in the beginning that when you look at the strategy, you also have to look at the results. So I was a little bit curious about what result the strategy has brought you.
What was that last part?
What result you saw from the strategy that you put in place?
Yeah, so I would tell you, for us, in 2020, like I mentioned, we were able to run the longest that we could. We ran longer than we did in 2019 in home delivery on peak, which really got a lot of product flowing. We also were able to leverage not only our DC inventory, but our store inventory to go support sales when the pandemic hit and everything shut down. In 21, I had no issues with product flow. I had the freshest assortment that I could have asked for when we got to fall, and even though there were 100 ships that were stuck out in Port of LA, we mitigated most of that by redirecting and reflowing product to different places. In 22, if you go look at retail results and you look at where inventory stood for most retailers, most people reported anywhere between 75 and 35% increase in inventory because they over forecasted what their sales were going to be and they bought into it based on the pandemic. I ran down 3%. And so, again, I credit my team for all of that because they're the ones who actually drove it. And but it was really this model, this principle of saying, what can I see? What's going to happen? What do I think is going to happen? And do I want to do something about it? And if I can, I'm going to. Yeah.
I have a question. First of all, great presentation.
Well, thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry, I thought you pointed at me.
I will not point.
First of all, great presentation. Thank you for
Thank
it. Question, you talk about KPIs.
Yep.
And you alluded earlier in your presentation, for example, D2C is very different than retail. How do you roll up KPIs to executives? Because one of the things I struggle with is when you look at a D2C, for example, those metrics on time and in full are very different than a retail. Do you keep them as separate metrics, or do you roll them up as a one metric?
I tended to keep them separate based on the businesses that we did. The only thing that I aggregated when I talked to anybody was what my combined supply chain spend was as a % of sales. And my goal every year and my team's goal every year was we want to keep bringing down our spend as a % of sale. And that was part of what we built into our strategy. But there were very few things that I would aggregate up into a common thing because then it just loses all of its meaning. Like and again, even when you get into like inventory productivity and turn and all those things are different in a D2C building than they're going to be in a cross-dock distribution facility and even sitting at the store. Yeah.
Dennis, that was great. Look, what you presented was 35 years of culmination of everything you've learned and you applied at Macy's, right? And from your background, it's just a lot of work. I mean, that was a lot of work what you did. Do you foresee everything that you described just get done, executed much faster with today's and future AI technology? Right there, just bang, press the button, send, it does it for me. Do you foresee that?
I actually do. Again, like I said, I've been spending a lot of time with a lot of startup companies. And some of the things they're working on is just fascinating to me. And whether it's AI enabled, and I sometimes tend to shy away from using AI and ML. I've been in way too many companies where board members have read a magazine on an airplane that said big data is the biggest thing we've got to go do, and then they're kind of like, what are we doing about big data? I'm like, you don't even know what it is. Like, why are we even talking about it? But I think technology is going to be one of the key drivers in being able to get to this model and make it work. I think the thing that's going to hold us back is the physical constraints of the buildings we operate. So I don't know if you all sat through the presentation Jim Hilderoff gave on operations, and was talking about 85% of the buildings in the U.S. aren't automated at a level above, let's say, conveyance and sorters, right? And so you think about that, and you say, well, now I want to add some level of flexibility. I want to divert product to a different lane. I want something to go through different. The sorter technologies are a pain in the butt to go deal with, right? You've got WMSs that you've got to go through that are old and archaic. You've got all of these things. And so turning that into this idea of how do I start to marry the automation and the technology advancements of automation into existing facilities while the technologies, because otherwise we're not going to be able to fully utilize the systems, right? The systems are going to be great and be like, you should go do this. And you're like, yeah, I can't. Like, it's fascinating, right? And so I think there's a blending of those two things that have to happen. And, you know, one of the things we were talking about is, you know, automation is getting to the point where it is easier to create places of automation, right? In the old days, if you wanted to go put a new sortation system in or you wanted to rebuild a building, you either had to shut it down or you had to create massive amounts of space. But with today's automation, there are ways to be able to take smaller places inside your building, start automation, get productivity and throughput, and expand and expand and expand and expand. It's a longer road, but it's way cheaper than building a brand new building, and probably a lot easier to get board support to go do. But I think we have to start thinking through those ways of how do we drive flexibility into a physically constrained network. What other questions? Yes?
It's not really a question. I honestly, so I spent 23 years at Macy's, not there when you were there, wish I was. Great presentation. I think it's a statement that you made that I just don't want it to get lost in your entire presentation. Relationship is what brings us forward. Relationship with your UPS. My relationship with my vendors during COVID is what brought us across the finish line. So technology is great, and we all run at 1,000,000 miles to catch up to it, but it's the relationship that really drives it home, and we can't lose the fact of humanity and working with our vendors as if they're people.
Yeah, I think that's I totally agree with that, and I've always, like, throughout my career, have been focused on this idea of partnerships, and I sit down with everybody, I'm like, when we start negotiating, it's like, this is going to go one of two ways. We can either be very transactional, or we can be partners. And at the end of the day, as partners, we both have things we have to solve for, and how do we do that collectively together? Because the reality is none of us have full control over everything in our supply chain, right? And so if we don't have the partnerships, then you're never going to be able to get to the level of flexibility that you want. And being able to leverage your partners who can help you with that, I think is a huge thing. The other thing I would say, and I didn't put this quote in here, but it's another, I love Winston Churchill quotes, I don't know why. But he made a comment that, and he was talking about planning, and I'll kind of translate it into strategy, but because I think the two kind of go hand in hand. At the end of the day, the plan is useless, right? Your strategy is useless. The act of planning and the act of building a strategy is invaluable. And why is that? Because the first thing you know when you finish a plan, it is wrong. If we were able to put a plan together of what was going to happen 3 to 5 years from now, or even a year from now, or next month, we would have all done it. So we know it's wrong. But the act of planning, the act of sitting down and going through your network and saying, okay, what do my nodes look like? Where are my constraints? What am I going to go do about it? When something happens that you won't know what that is going to be, you will have at least thought through actions that you can take to mitigate it. Without that, then you're just firefighting, which is always a bad answer and never cost effective, right? And so the act of planning, the act of putting a strategy together, the act of sitting down and saying, how do I think about this? And you may use different words than I did or have a different model, but for us, it was sitting down and saying, okay, how do I get visibility? How do I get predictability? How do I get flexibility? And we landed on things where if I can't get it, if I can't get the flexibility, I don't want the predictability. I want something telling me that I should go do something different when I physically can't. Put that on the back burner until we figure out how to go do that. What comes next, right? But that act of doing that plan, when something does happen, you can react to it. We started, at Macy's, we started actually diversifying our ports in November of 2020. So in November of 2020, we had about call it 85-ish% of our product flowing in through LA. In 2020, we started diversifying our ports for two reasons. One, there's a lot of risk flowing into LA, but two, at the time, the union contract was up in 2020 that we fully anticipated was going to be a problem. And so we quickly started diversifying. So when all the boats got backed up, we had already gone from 85% to less than 50% of our product even touching LA. And then the stuff that was touching LA, we still had the ability to move it in different places along the West Coast. And so we were wrong as to what happened, but it was a good strategy for us to go do because something different happened that allowed us to take advantage of that. And we pulled that plan in hard when we started. We did the same thing with our sourcing. We started looking at early on, okay, how do we get multi-country? How do we get multi-vendor? Like, I don't want to spread my volume out, but I also don't want to be stuck in a country if tariffs go up or if there's other destabilization. Like, we weren't anticipating a pandemic or a lockdown. We were just anticipating it's going to get ugly. So how do we start thinking about that? And so we started then doing multi-sourcing and multi-country sourcing and all of those other things. So I just say that because I do think sometimes we can get caught up in it, or our non-supply chain friends can get caught up into what was your strategy, and that's not what happened. Your strategy is never going to be what happened, right? I always tell people I plant the flag in sand so I can pick it up and move it, right? Because at the end of the day, what I know right now is where I put it is probably not where it needs to be based on what's going to be occurring between now and then. And we have to have the ability to go do that. But that you can't do that if you haven't thought through what those actions and activities are. All right, so with that, if any more questions? If there's no more questions, you guys enjoyed the rest of your dessert. It was awesome speaking to all of you.
Thank you, Dennis. Let's give him another round of applause. Before this dinner concludes, I do want to mention that, of course, the night is still young, and